You're very welcome to this conversation about the political ramifications of the car bomb that took the life of Darya Dugina, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, the Russian political philosopher, ideologue, ultra-reactionary, intellectual entertainer, and spewer of venom. When somebody dies, the people with integrity react adequately, and people without integrity often end up playing football with the death. And when the death is the death of somebody public and the death of somebody who was ethically unlovely, this effect is magnified. And you would know this effect. I mean, if somebody in your life has died and you've had to lead the process, especially if it's an unexpected death, and you've had to lead the process, not just organizationally, but emotionally and spiritually around their death, you would see that there are some people who are going to play football, get toxic, and use the death for their psychological purposes. And that would be political purposes if we were in the political arena as we are here. This is, as we say, magnified when it's the public death, public figure, a figure who's also ethically unlovely. And so for that reason, I want to start with a kind of matter of moral economy, if you like, of economy of ethical sentiment. How do you balance in yourself the fact that, okay, we've got a kid in her late 20s that was saying really dumb things, that was killed. On the other hand, no, that person killed is connected with an odious figure and is herself an odious figure to a good extent. How do we balance this, and how do we talk about this in the context of having to be adequate to these kinds of incompatible moral pools? And I want to start with that because typically a lot of self-indulgent toxicity has come out, particularly on Twitter, about the death of Darya Dugina. And after we do a little bit of balancing on that front, I want us to move to a quick chat about the degree of genuine influence that Dugin has in Russia and overseas. And finally, the political ramifications of this car bomb that took the life of Dugin's daughter. I think that's probably what we're here for. But let's start with a little bit of a moral conversation. Now let's do a little bit of moral weighing up. Let's ignore the people who just say serves her right or serves him right. Partly because as a fraction of your economy of moral sentiment in response to what happened, that's not inappropriate. But it is inappropriate as your first and immediate reaction, and your only immediate reaction. But putting these aside, what becomes interesting are the criticisms that Russian oppositional figures have got. Political commentators, political actors, journalists, academics, for both saying that the events are tragic and unfortunate, and for, in rarer cases, coming close to expressing condolences to the Dugin family. That's been rarer. I've noticed that Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the Russian dissident, has expressed condolences to the Dugin family. And these Russians have been criticized as though that were somehow an act of complicity or some kind of inappropriate over-affiliation with the Putin regime. And I want to take as an example a thread by a Russian expert who's one of the Russian Ukraine experts I don't recommend you follow, Sergei Sumlenny. Let's look at his thread. Russian prominent liberals publish their mourn about the death of Darya Dugina, a 30-year-old, quote-unquote, I'm going to say, Nazi party member and a prominent, quote-unquote, Nazi propagandist who openly said ghastly things about Ukraine, which is correct. And here he gives the example of two people who have expressed regret about the tragic events. Let's read his second tweet. The West totally ignores how Russian liberals are integrated into the Nazi propaganda system. And here he shows Alexei Venediktov, the ex-editor of Echo Moscow. Ex, because Echo doesn't exist anymore. And here Venediktov is with Margot Simonyan, the odious propagandist, and with Maria Zakharova, the odious front face of the Russian Foreign Ministry. And then he shows Yevgenia Albats, and Yevgenia Albats is an important person with an academic background and a rich journalistic and editorial background. Let's look at the two tweets he is quoted here. The first comes from Yulia Latinina, who has called Dugin a fascist, I think, just in the last few hours. And she says that the killing of the daughter of Dugin is horrible, aimless, unconstructive, and scary. She was, as it were, milking the system for her benefit, in a kind of unlovely way, the implication goes, but she wasn't, even one of the top 1,000 people involved in an evil way in this regime. She was relatively unimportant, no matter what kind of nonsense and sort of bile she wrote. That's the rough implication of what Yulia Latinina says. So let's ask ourselves, who is this woman who he is picking out? Well, this is a woman who experienced 2 attacks on her, I think with some kind of a gas, and I think with some kind of explosion in the second instance. And the second attack was interpreted by her and others as an assassination attempt, and she has been in order to protect her life, evicted out of Russia for the last 5 or 6 years. Not a good example of somebody sort of ingratiating themselves in Moscow. Then there is Maxim Mironov, who tweets, "Honestly speaking, I don't understand the mass cheering. The daughter doesn't answer for the father." Well, we could say that's a bit questionable because the daughter was also behaving very badly, but I don't know where Maxim is now. I think he is a finance lecturer in Spain. Okay. Then we've got these couple of pictures of the man with Coco the Clown, white hair, Alexei Venediktov. And Venediktov was famous for indeed socially interacting with elements of the regime. And he considered it to be his political duty to do so for 2 reasons. Partly to keep tabs on what's going on, but partly to keep the station of Echo Moscow, the radio station, open, keep it alive. We should discuss this in more detail, but a brief way of putting it would be that he was in a horrible way prostituting himself so that this platform, Echo Moscow, would be available for people to bring speech to it, people who don't prostitute themselves. So he engaged in this slimy stuff to keep the station open, which is the main way for Russians who don't do any slimy stuff to talk to the country. So complex, at least complex. I would consider Venediktov more a hero than a villain, for obvious reasons, and nearly anybody of sensibility would too. But then something else. Venediktov is now a foreign agent. These people from the regime are now not really talking to him much, and his station has been closed. So that's important context. Then we've got Yevgenia Albats. Yevgenia Albats, who is shown in this picture outside a football stadium, is a person with integrity, and she is saying anti-Putin, anti-regime things, while I think still based in Moscow, that hardly anybody would be courageous enough to say. So she is doing really almost heroic work in the kind of conversations she's leading, I think still from Russia. And obviously it's abhorrent and repulsive and indulgent to criticize somebody like that, and especially for that criticism to come from Sergei Somlenny. I'm not going to assess the following tweet, but let's read the final tweet. Of course, the liberal circle is not identical with the Kremlin one, and it sometimes is targeted by state-run attacks, including very brutal ones. But the lifestyle of both is not a fight. It is a complicated and sophisticated cohabitation, a mutual dependency, and often liking. Bad. That's a problem that always occurs. And I think the way to guide us through it in terms of at least what you should feel is to say that it's very important to feel both. It's very important to feel that in some cases it is reasonable to say that somebody's tragic outcome is something that their own actions contributed to. At the same time, it's also important to say, well, we don't like 30-year-old kids who are spewing propaganda to be killed just because they're spewing propaganda, partly because they're not engaged in any violence, and partly because they're young, and partly because they are spectacularly unimportant in the scheme of the Russian informational environment, and partly just because we don't like human beings being killed extrajudicially. So I think that's the beginning of a conversation about balance. What I want to encourage here is both and, rather than, as it were, the idea that just because you recognize the evil stuff that Dugin in particular himself has been coming up with, that you can't then speak about it not being good to see 30-year-old kids blown up in car bombs. Well, let's now get to Dugin himself and the political implications. Dugin's importance. I think we're going to be brief here, but basically you've got to be aware of two things. Dugin's genuinely influential. He is influential, but he's not politically influential. So when you see 74 tweet threads about Dugin, Putin's brain loses his daughter in car blast, when you see independent experts writing long LinkedIn articles about how Putin can be understood via Dugin's ideas, unless it's a very smart and constructive use of the example of Dugin, which could be the case, but most of the time just assume that that's an indication that the author doesn't have an adequate grounding in Russian history over the last 30 years, doesn't have an adequate grounding in the Russian language, and doesn't have an adequate grounding in the sort of taste and smell for the on-the-ground political environment in Russia today and in the last few months and years. So Putin's feeling about Dugin is a bit sort of sniggery and giggly. Putin has a track record of sometimes mentioning Ilyin, sometimes mentioning Berdayev. So these are earlier figures from the early part of the 20th century. He doesn't mention Dugin, and I think if we were to find a tape of Putin discussing Dugin at some event, which I'm not aware of, it'd be with a bit of a giggle, for two reasons. Dugin's ideas are both too complex and too silly for Putin. I mean, Putin would find many of Dugin's sort of pumped up flourishes absurd, like when Dugin was speaking around 2007, 2008 about how Putin should be canonized as a kind of Russian monarch, or when Dugin was speaking about the moral imperative for men to have beards. So Putin would think that Dugin is silly, and Putin would also think that Dugin is too complex. I mean, Dugin is immersed, at least in his own reading of his intellectual construction in postmodernist ideas, in Heideggerian ideas. So because he is too complex and too silly for the Kremlin, what happens in terms of that link between him and the Kremlin is that it occurs in reverse. So Dugin is not somebody who's ever led anything. Dugin is somebody who sees where the train is going, and he's trying to get ahead of it. So the causation is in reverse. This is entrepreneurial pitching of ideas to fit the political milieu. It's not the construction and shaping of a political milieu. And even if you detach Dugin from politics, if you detach Dugin from concrete political decisions, and you say, come on, Alexander Gerlevich, give us a story of where Russian culture moves next, his answer is, we've got to reflect on it and make it happen. Which is an extraordinary answer. Partly because of its vacuity, partly because it assumes that you can sort of concoct a cultural construction for Russia, as opposed to the way these things happen in reality, which is that they evolve via moments of cultural moment coming and going. So Dugin's influence is very minimal, close to zero with the Kremlin. He's not Putin's brain, he's not Putin's anything. He has virtually no influence. I would say, in fact, no influence on direct political matters. But he has a kind of cultural influence, and his cultural influence works in a very weird way. And it's like this. Dugin is mythologized more in the West than he is in Russia. And Russian nationalists, proto-fascists, quasi-fascists, whatever labels you want to use, then exploit this myth of Dugin's significance in the West. So that's, I think, what you've got to know. And in terms of Darya Dugina, I mean, she is not even 1/20th of the significance of the major, most toxic propagandists in Russia. So if somebody was going to take out a major Russian propagandist for some reason, they were not going to start with Darya, or not rationally so, at least. So that's a little bit on the influence. Let's get to the political implications now. Vladimir Putin has written a letter to the Dugin family expressing his condolences. Dugin has made a statement saying that the only thing that makes sense in the context of this tragic terror attack is to win the war. And he calls the killing of his daughter a despicable and cruel crime that took away a bright, talented person with a real Russian heart, kind, loving, warm, and open. She honestly served her people in the motherland and showed what it means to be a true Russian patriot. And Putin's letter to the Dugin family mirrors this. What's interesting, though, is where the Russian propaganda machine is beginning to move. And they're beginning to ask for action, for some suppression at home, and maybe even for some activity abroad. Here is Margot Simonyan, the odious propagandist, saying that the story that the Russian authorities are currently concocting about this should legitimately be followed by consequences such as sending around spy fanciers, the people who did the Skripal terror attack, to wherever they need to go and take appropriate action. In this case, she's talking about Tallinn. Now, that's therefore one block of possibilities, that this is, however this was done, an advantage for Russian security state, Russian agencies to do some things abroad, but particularly at home, to tighten the bolts. And it's certainly true that certain kinds of domestic repression are going to be more possible after this than before this. We talked on the main channel. By the way, if you are new here, this is our second channel. This is where we have longer and casual, unedited conversations. Go to the main channel if you want to watch more polished, shorter content. That's where most of the views come in. The video that we did about the fascist turn in Russia, the totalitarian turn, if you like, and how far it's gone, is what this intersects with. So if the regime wants to go more in the totalitarian direction, I think it's gone in a direction to a degree of about 20%. If it wants to go 25%, this is the sort of thing that will allow it to more easily push that dial on. But there is a second story, and that's that the regime may be beginning to now have a problem with ultra conservatives in Russia. And ultra conservatives in Russia means these sort of deranged positions of the kind that Dugin took, and that these people are now seeing Putin as being too moderate, too measured, too passive in the way he is conducting both the war and repression at home, and that this party is now, party in loose sense of the word, is now seen as a mild risk to stability by the regime, and therefore there's now a headache for the regime in the direction of what do we do about all of these ultra-nationalists, hyper-reactionaries who are saying that the regime is not going anywhere near far enough. And here I want to go to a Telegram post by Tatiana Stanova. I'm going to throw her credentials up. And she makes a couple of good points. One of them is this, and I'm going to read it and translate it at the same time. So be a little patient with me in case I go astray. She says, in either case, in the current situation, future decisions of Putin may look weak and less legitimate for the shaken conservative part of the elites and society in general in Russia. The killing of Dugina creates conditions in which a political demand might be formed for much more radicalism from the political leadership and much more radicalism from Putin. But the Kremlin could never fulfill such demands. So that I do think is now plausibly a problem for the Kremlin. That, we've got this sort of, let us say, 20% of the population that's vehemently against the war. We've got 60% of the population that is passive and politically immobilized, and we've got 20% of the population that support the war. And of that 20, there's a fraction who are in a kind of ultra-nationalist, ultra-reactionary camp, who are saying that Putin is a kind of impotent moderate who is no longer able to serve the country's interests properly. As a result, you've got to worry about this, either by pressurizing the regime to do more or by making the regime change its personnel, including the personnel at the top. So as far as the Russian regime is concerned, if the Russian regime did have anything to do with this bombing, then we're going to have to perhaps start with two stories. The first story is about agencies laying the foundation for greater repression. The second story is about the regime getting worried about this ultra-reactionary demographic in society getting a little bit out of hand. to keep this video evergreen, I want to leave it here rather than get involved in the particular causation. But either way, this doesn't bode well. This event does not bode well for Ukraine. This event does not bode well for Russia's neighbors. And this event does not bode well for Russians in Russia who perceive that the regime is at war with them too, because there may be escalatory and repressive consequences, and we're gonna watch them together. Thanks so much for your attention.